I never believed my friendship with Julian would destroy my marriage because I told myself it was completely innocent, and I laughed whenever Mark looked suspicious, saying he was ridiculous. I always described Julian as my brother from college, the kind of man who could never threaten our home, but I secretly loved the attention he gave me. Whenever Mark asked why I stayed out late, I insisted I was only catching up with an old friend, and I mocked him later to my sister for being insecure. Clara always told me I deserved more fun and that Mark was boring, and I clung to those words whenever guilt tried to creep in. I posted selfies with Julian at the cafe, writing captions about friendship, and my friends responded with hearts, which made me feel untouchable. I thought attention from others mattered more than Mark's doubts, and I believed laughter could erase every concern, but I underestimated the power of his silence. While I dismissed him as sulking, he was gathering receipts, photos, and notes that I never imagined would matter, and he kept everything hidden behind calm eyes. The morning I found stamped papers on the kitchen table with my name printed clearly, I realized the game I had been playing was already finished, and I was the only one who never understood the rules. From the very beginning, I told myself that Julian was safe because he had always been part of my past, not my future, and I repeated to everyone that he was like a brother. I loved saying that because it made me feel clever, as if I could dismiss any suspicion with a single phrase that sounded wholesome and believable. Mark asked why we were always texting, and I turned it into proof of his insecurity, telling Clara that he could not handle me having friends. I said that men who demand boundaries are controlling, and I framed every concern as an attack on my independence. Julian and I met often at the coffee shop, laughing about college days, and I convinced myself the pictures we took together were harmless memories. When Mark noticed a receipt for 2 drinks late at night, I insisted he was imagining things, and I told my friends he was jealous of a friendship. That word jealous became my weapon, because I knew people hated men who looked controlling, and I used it every time to shut down questions. Clara told me I was right, that Mark should trust me more, and she even called him pathetic for doubting me. That encouragement felt like armor, so I leaned on it heavily, believing my side would always win because I had people repeating my story. At home, I laughed whenever Mark tried to bring up Julian, saying loudly that he was overthinking, and I would roll my eyes as though I were tired of babysitting. My children were too young to understand, but I noticed Evan's silence when arguments filled the kitchen, and I told myself he was simply shy. Sophie would ask if Julian was visiting again, and I smiled as if it were the most natural question in the world. I told myself that including Julian in small family moments was harmless, but in truth, I enjoyed how different he made me feel, and I chased that feeling even when I knew it looked wrong. At family dinners, I sometimes joked that Mark hated my college friend because he was too serious, and I said it loudly enough for others to laugh. My mother-in-law Sylvia did not laugh. She only raised her eyebrows and changed the subject, but I ignored her reaction and continued telling my jokes. I loved the way people chuckled, because every laugh felt like a small victory that protected me from accountability. Mark stayed quiet at those moments, and I told myself his silence was proof that he had no argument left. What I could not see was that silence was becoming his shield, and behind it he was collecting everything I dismissed. I always mocked him for being too focused on numbers and paperwork in his job, but I never imagined he would turn those skills against me at home. Each time I left for the coffee shop, I said I was working late or running errands, and I smiled at Julian's messages while telling myself it was innocent. But technology betrayed me when my phone synced to the family tablet, and one evening, a late-night message from Julian appeared on the screen while Mark sat beside Evan. I quickly brushed it off, saying it was nothing, but I could see in his eyes that something inside him shifted. He did not argue or shout, he simply looked at the message quietly, and that calm reaction unsettled me more than if he had accused me directly. I told Clara later that he was sulking again, and she laughed that jealous men always overplay their hand, but even as I laughed with her, my stomach felt heavy. I continued to post online about my friendship with Julian, and I wrote captions that made Mark look paranoid, which earned me supportive comments from friends. That attention made me feel safe again, so I doubled down on the story, even though a small part of me worried about Mark's new silence. When I noticed him spending more time at the desk with his folders neatly stacked, I told myself he was just being dramatic, wasting time to make himself feel important. I never understood he was already building the case that would later crush me, because I still believe performance was stronger than paper. The birthday dinner at the Italian bistro became another stage for me, because I wanted everyone to see Mark as the insecure husband who could not handle his wife's friendships. I thought if I made enough jokes about his jealousy, then people would laugh and agree with me, leaving him powerless. I mentioned loudly that he always rolled his eyes when Julian texted me, and I called him too serious while sipping my wine with a smile. Clara clapped her hands and laughed with me, repeating that men who doubt friendships are pathetic, and Alan and Nina chuckled nervously. Sylvia shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable, but I ignored her because the sound of laughter felt like winning. Mark said almost nothing all night, and his silence made me bolder because I mistook it for surrender instead of strategy. On the way home, he asked quietly if I thought spending so much time with Julian was appropriate, and I quickly reframed it as him being paranoid. I told myself that framing every concern as an attack on my independence was the smartest way to win, and I felt clever repeating the same story again and again. At home, he opened the family laptop, and I saw the screen glow as photos synced automatically, but I dismissed it as harmless. Later, I noticed the images included selfies of Julian and me at the cafe, with my smile a little too bright, but I told myself it meant nothing. I reassured myself that Mark would never dare use them against me, because no one in our circle would believe him over me. The next morning, I told Clara that he was sulking again, and she repeated that jealous men ruin their own marriages, which comforted me. I shared screenshots in our group chat, showing comments from friends agreeing that Mark was insecure, and I presented them to him as proof that he was wrong. He said nothing, which frustrated me, because I wanted him to argue so I could twist his words. Instead, he stacked papers at his desk, and his quiet movements made me uneasy even as I laughed loudly in the kitchen. I convinced myself that silence was weakness, but inside, I felt the first sting of doubt about what he was doing. My children sensed the tension, with Evan staying quieter during meals, and Sophie asking if Julian was coming over again, and I brushed it off with a smile. I told myself it was normal for kids to see family friends often, and I even convinced myself that it made our life seem fuller. At Sylvia's birthday, I made sure to mention again that Mark disliked Julian, and when people chuckled, I felt triumphant, as though the narrative was set in stone. But the way Sylvia left early after paying the bill should have told me something, and the way Marjorie glared across the table should have unsettled me more. Instead, I carried the story home and turned it into another weapon, telling Clara that Sylvia was against me and wanted to paint me as disloyal. I told Sylvia that Clara encouraged me to go out more, hoping to turn them against each other, because division had always worked in my favor. What I did not realize was that Mark had already begun showing Sylvia certain things, building trust with her quietly, while I focused on chasing laughter. At home, when I saw him close the laptop slowly after reviewing the synced photos, I felt a chill that I refused to acknowledge. I told myself it was nothing, only another attempt to sulk, but my heart raced in a way I could not fully ignore. Instead of admitting fear, I doubled down by meeting Julian more often, posting more photos, and reminding everyone that my husband was simply paranoid. In truth, though, every time I saw the laptop light up, I felt like I was watching my own mask slowly peel away, exposing me more than I wanted to admit. After that dinner, I realized the only way to stay ahead was by controlling the story, so I pushed it harder than ever before, making sure everyone heard my version first. I told Clara that Mark was punishing me with silence, and she repeated it back until it sounded like truth in my head. I told Sylvia that Mark refused to speak to me properly, leaving me lonely, but to Clara, I said he was watching me constantly like a guard. I twisted both versions depending on who I spoke with, making sure each person saw me as the victim and him as the villain. I kept insisting to everyone that Julian was just like a brother, and I made them repeat it back until it became a shield, online. I posted pictures with Julian at the cafe, writing captions about friendship and loyalty, while hiding the reality that I was carefully curating appearances. Each comment or emoji I received felt like protection, as though the digital approval could erase every moment of doubt in my marriage. Still, Mark's silence made me restless, because he no longer reacted with anger or even visible frustration, and that left me without anything to twist. I had always depended on his reactions, because the more emotional he became, the easier it was to call him controlling or insecure. Without that fuel, my stories felt weaker, so I exaggerated them more, telling Clara that he had forbidden me from seeing Julian, even though he never said that. Clara clapped and told me I was brave for refusing control, and her words pushed me further into reckless confidence. At the same time, Evan became more withdrawn, refusing to look at me when I mentioned Julian, and Sophie asked if Julian was going to tuck her in one night, which shocked me for a moment. I laughed it off as a child's confusion, but inside I felt a sting that I quickly smothered with excuses. I convinced myself that my children would always see me as fun, and their father as boring, so I carried on posting and laughing. One afternoon I returned home and found a small USB drive placed carefully on the desk, and I smirked because I thought Mark was trying to scare me. I told myself he wanted me to feel guilty, but instead I felt powerful because I believed I still had the louder voice. What I did not know was that he had already shown the drive to Sylvia, and inside was dashcam footage of my car parked outside Julian's apartment on nights when I claimed to be shopping. The footage had timestamps that matched missed school pickups, and Sylvia's quiet notes about covering for me fit perfectly into the record. While I told Clara that Mark was making things up, he was already building a case with evidence that no one could laugh away. I kept going to Julian anyway, convincing myself that love of excitement excused me, and I repeated to everyone that Mark was trying to cage me. The truth was that my lies were slipping because Alan and Nina stopped reacting to my online posts, and even Clara sounded less enthusiastic over time. I felt exposed, yet I doubled down by posting more selfies and repeating that jealous husbands never understand, even though my words now felt hollow. At night, when I passed Mark's desk and saw the folders stacked neatly, my chest tightened because I knew they held my own words against me. Still, I laughed and called him pathetic in my head, convincing myself that he would never actually use them. But deep down, every quiet night and every silent glance made me realize he was preparing something far beyond my control, and I tried not to imagine what that silence really meant. The neighborhood barbecue became my next opportunity to prove control, because I told myself that if people saw me laughing with Julian, then Mark would look small and sulking again. I wore a dress that drew attention, and I stayed close to Julian while we cooked burgers together, making sure people noticed the easy closeness. I thought neighbors would laugh with me like my friends, but instead I saw quiet stares, and even Alan shaking his head slightly. Still, I brushed it off and convinced myself they were jealous, so I leaned harder into the act, touching Julian's arm while laughing loudly. Mark stood nearby with a plate for the children, silent as always, and I told myself his silence was weakness again. When we returned home that night, he asked calmly about boundaries with Julian around the children, and I instantly snapped inside, accusing him in my head of punishing me for being attractive. I carried that story straight to Clara, who told me once again that Mark was pathetic, and she even suggested I should pack a bag to make him panic. I liked the sound of that advice because it gave me a sense of control, but deep down, I wondered if leaving would even shake him anymore. To keep power, I tried splitting the family further, telling Sylvia that Clara was stirring trouble, and telling Clara that Sylvia wanted to push me out. I always believed division worked in my favor, but this time their silence unsettled me, because neither responded the way I expected. Evan avoided Julian at the barbecue, hiding behind Mark, and Sophie asked me afterward why Daddy looked sad, and I told myself she was too young to understand. That night, I tried to check our joint bank account, but the password no longer worked, and panic shot through me, even though I told myself it was just a glitch. In the kitchen, I found a manila folder with my name printed neatly across the top, filled with receipts, screenshots, and printed messages, all organized carefully. My stomach twisted as I flipped through the pages and saw photos of me with Julian, and even conversations where I mocked Mark to friends. I laughed out loud to myself, saying it was pathetic scrapbooking, but my hands were trembling while I closed the folder. I quickly messaged Clara that Mark, was bluffing and trying to intimidate me with paperwork, and she told me not to be afraid. I also messaged Julian, telling him drama was exhausting, pretending I was the one pulling away, though I still craved his attention. Walking through the house later, I heard Mark outside in the driveway speaking softly into a recorder, rehearsing steady lines, and the red light blinking filled me with dread. I peeked through the window and saw his calm expression, not angry, not broken, just determined, and I realized for the first time that silence could be stronger than noise. I told myself again that he was wasting time, but my pulse raced and I could not ignore the sense that something irreversible was coming. The neighbors had seen me flirt, the friends were pulling away, the children were confused, and the bank account was already locked. So all the pieces were falling into place without me understanding how to stop them. Still, I laughed the next morning and posted another photo with Julian, writing a caption about loyalty and friendship, trying to convince myself I was still in control. But when I noticed fewer reactions than before, and even Clara skipping a reply, the performance felt hollow, and I wondered how long I could keep pretending. Sunday brunch at the Italian bistro was supposed to be my chance to flip the story back in my favor, because I thought if I laughed loudly enough and told my version first, then everyone would side with me again. I arrived with Clara and my mother, determined to make Mark look insecure in front of people, and I rehearsed clever lines in my head about jealous husbands. For the first few minutes it seemed like it might work, with Clara whispering encouragement and my mother smiling uneasily, but then a courier entered the room and asked for me by my full name. He placed a thick envelope directly in front of me, and I felt my face burn before I even touched it, because I already knew it carried the truth I had been avoiding. I opened it with shaking hands and saw the stamp of the court on the first page, followed by words that made my chest tighten until I could hardly breathe. Inside was a petition for legal separation, a proposed parenting plan for Evan and Sophie with exact pickup times, and a notice that our finances were already separated. The envelope also held a request for exclusive possession of the house until refinancing, and then an exhibit list with thumbnails of every piece of evidence I had mocked as meaningless. I saw selfies of me with Julian, receipts from the coffee shop, dash cam footage of my car parked outside his apartment, and even group chat screenshots where I called Mark pathetic. My stomach churned as I realized every little thing I once dismissed as harmless was now printed, labeled, and attached to my name forever. I tried to act outraged, raising my voice and calling it harassment, but the silence around the table was heavier than any words I could have spoken. The waiter glanced at the stamp, Clara looked down at her lap, and my mother sipped her water without meeting my eyes. No one defended me, no one laughed, no one repeated my lines, and suddenly I felt naked in front of everyone with nothing to protect me. I tapped my card quickly to pay for the meal, wanting to leave, but the machine beeped and declined because the joint account had already been frozen. Heat rushed to my face as I scrambled for another card, and I knew in that moment that Mark had thought of everything before I had thought of anything. He left the table calmly and stepped outside with his phone, speaking in measured tones as he called his lawyer, while I sat frozen with the papers still spread in front of me. Clara leaned close and muttered that I should fight, but her voice lacked conviction, and even she refused to look at me directly. My mother kept her eyes on the tablecloth, saying nothing, and I knew she was finally finished defending me. I stared at the stamped documents, feeling the weight of every page, and for the first time, I realized that my stories, my jokes, and my performances were completely powerless against the law. Everything I had mocked as weakness had turned into strength, and I was left with nothing but empty words. The people I had counted on for laughter and support were silent, and silence was louder than any applause I ever received. Walking into the courthouse felt like stepping into a different reality, because nothing in that building cared about laughter, stories, or jokes, only papers with stamps that weighed more than my words ever could. I sat at the long wooden table, staring across at Mark, who looked calm and collected with his lawyer beside him, while I felt my stomach twisting in knots. I told myself I could still win if I spoke loudly enough, insisting that Julian was only a friend. But every page in front of the judge told a different story. Mark's lawyer presented receipts, text messages, and photographs, each tied carefully to dates and times. And my own words in group chats were read into the record like stones piling against me. I raised my voice and said Mark was jealous, said he was punishing me for having confidence. But the judge barely looked at me before returning to the evidence. My lawyer whispered that the record was too strong to fight, and I felt cold as I realized the silence I mocked had turned into my downfall. Sylvia sat behind Mark with folded hands, her eyes steady, while Clara avoided looking at me altogether, pretending to study her phone. My mother shifted nervously in her seat, clearly uncomfortable, and I could feel the weight of disappointment pressing from every direction. The judge listened as Mark described a clear schedule for Evan and Sophie, listing exact pickups, drop-offs, and boundaries about unrelated adults in the home. Each word struck me because I heard Julian's name without being spoken, and I knew everyone in that room understood the truth I had tried so hard to disguise. I said again that Julian was like a brother, that nothing inappropriate ever happened, but my voice cracked, and I heard the weakness in it myself. Mark remained steady, never raising his tone, only pointing to the evidence and asking for fairness, which made me look even more frantic by comparison. When the judge finally spoke, the words carried no humor, no sympathy, only authority, and I felt my world shrink as the orders were read aloud. Shared custody was granted, with strict schedules that left little room for flexibility, and specific conditions that protected the children from unnecessary exposure to outsiders. Mark was granted temporary exclusive use of the family home until refinancing, and the accounts were already divided, leaving me with nothing but what had been set aside separately. The judge also ordered co-parenting classes and placed restrictions on using the children in social media posts or arguments, stripping away even the audience I had once relied on. When the stamp came down on the final page, the sound echoed like a hammer in my chest, leaving me breathless and shaking. The clerk slid a paper toward me, with my move-out time clearly printed, along with the new door code that would activate at 6 in the evening. My fingers trembled as I picked it up, reading the cold lines that spelled out exactly how my life would change, and for once, I had no clever joke to hide behind. My mother laid her hand on my shoulder, but said nothing, and that silence felt heavier than any words, because it meant even she had accepted the outcome. Sylvia looked at her son with quiet pride, while Clara slipped out quickly, unwilling to face me after cheering me into this disaster for months. Mark gathered his papers neatly, thanked the judge, and left the room without glancing at me, his calmness the final proof that I had lost completely. I wanted to scream, to demand he look back, to remind him of our years together, but my throat tightened, and nothing came out. I sat frozen in the wooden chair, holding stamped documents heavier than any burden I had ever carried, knowing that everything I once mocked had become the chains around me. For so long I believed laughter made me untouchable, but the truth was that silence, patience, and evidence had defeated me more completely than any argument ever could. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.